buenas todos. Vamos a empezar con el espacio vacío en la cosmología temprana de Immanuel Kant, Paulo, Sergio, Mendoza, y bueno, adelante.
Muchas gracias. Bien, antes de entrar en materia, quisiera iniciar con unas cuestiones preliminares, particularmente de índole metodológica. El ejercicio que ahora les voy a presentar se inscribe en esa línea de investigación que conocemos como Kant-Forschung, ¿no? Recordemos, Hinske es uno de los que presenta esta tripartita división de las principales líneas de investigación en los estudios kantianos. Primero la Kant-Philologie, después la Kant-Forschung y finalmente el Kantianismus, ¿no? Entonces, yo me enfoco en esta rama que busca estudiar la figura de Kant desde el punto de vista histórico, historiográfico y biográfico. Y particularmente me ayudo de la historia de las fuentes, ¿no? Que también Norbert Hinske nos ayudó a puntualizar cuáles son las 6 principales fuentes a las que podemos recurrir para el estudio del pensamiento de Kant, pues que son estas que aparecen allí, ¿no? Las declaraciones del propio Kant, referencias que pueda tener en su correspondencia o en sus escritos póstumos, o en apuntes de cursos universitarios, ¿no? Tipo Mongrovius o Herder o la lógica Yeshe. Entonces son apuntes importantes. También tenemos referencias explícitas o implícitas a Kant, pero en otros autores de su tiempo que nos ayudan a reconstruir el pensamiento de Kant, profesores que tuvo Kant en Königsberg, manuales, textos que empleó Kant pues, para impartir sus cursos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, pues, los textos de Baumgarten, que son también importantes, y finalmente el ambiente, ¿no? La atmósfera intelectual, científica, filosófica que rodeó a Kant durante toda su trayectoria. También otro enfoque metodológico del que me apoyo es la historia intelectual, ¿no? Que en realidad es una amalgama de metodologías, pero particularmente la Translatio Studiorum, ¿no? Es un enfoque que nos ayuda a entender cómo la transmisión de ideas, teorías, tradiciones, conocimientos, se da de un contexto a otro, ¿no? Entonces, el enfoque es que en realidad lo que ocurre es una traducción de estos conceptos, de estas ideas, de estas tradiciones, para pasar de un contexto a otro. Y en nuestro caso, para la cuestión del espacio vacío, pues nos enmarcamos en ese mundo que desde la época antigua hasta ya bien entrada la época moderna, llamaban filosofía natural o filosofía de la naturaleza, ¿no? Que es una perspectiva que hoy nos resulta más o menos distinta, no empata bien con nuestro mapa disciplinario, pero bueno, hay que tener en cuenta estas distinciones. La filosofía natural incluía a la cosmología, y bueno, por cosmología debemos entender también dos componentes importantes. Una metafísica de la naturaleza. Recordemos que Christian Wolff, pero también otros escritores, sobre todo de manuales de la época, hacían una división entre una metafísica general, u ontología, y una metafísica particular o especial, que podría ser la cosmología, podría ser la neumatología, podría ser la psicología racional, podría ser la teología natural, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, es una división que involucra una perspectiva metafísica, eso es importante. Y por otro lado, también incluye un enfoque científico, ¿no? Un enfoque de ciencia natural que en la época estaba fundamentalmente dominado por la naciente mecánica y por la astronomía, que en realidad ya tenía más largo tiempo. Bueno, finalmente, con esto ya termino las observaciones preliminares, hago una ubicación. Es importante siempre hacer esta ubicación en el corpus kantiano. La cuestión del espacio vacío la ubico en la primera síntesis precrítica y principalmente en estas dos obras, ¿no? Un ensayo muy breve de unas 6 páginas en la edición académica, que bueno, el título es de media página tan solo, pero es muy breve el ensayo sobre la cuestión de la rotación de la Tierra, ¿no? Que publican escribe desde el verano del 1754, pero comienza a publicarse a inicios del 55. Y después viene una obra un poco más conocida, que es la Historia General o Historia Universal de la Naturaleza y Teoría del Cielo, ¿no? que es una obra que muestra más el genio científico, el genio cosmológico y astronómico hasta cierto punto también de Kant, que es una de las facetas menos conocidas, ¿no? de de este pensador. Bueno, en el ensayo sobre la velocidad de la rotación terrestre, primero hay que tener en cuenta que Kant se adhiere a la afirmación de Newton, y que en realidad era una convicción más o menos generalizada ya en la época, de que el movimiento de los cuerpos celestes, incluido el de la Tierra, es un movimiento totalmente libre e inimpedido, ¿no? Libre e imperturbado, también se utiliza eso, ¿no? Es un movimiento uniforme, constante, y bueno, además, ya después, en la siguiente obra, también circular, ¿no? Pero bueno, en este momento, el espacio a través del cual se mueven los astros, para que sea realmente libre e inimpedido, pues debe ser un espacio carente de toda materia que resista a ese movimiento, ¿no? No dice Kant literalmente que el espacio tenga que estar vacío. Dice que es un espacio que está lleno con materia infinitamente poco resistente. Unendliche, wenig, widerstehender Materie, ¿no? Infinitamente poco resistente la materia, ¿no? Entonces, eso es la alusión que hay en este ensayo breve. En la historia general de la naturaleza, repito, es una obra un poco más conocida, Kant ensaya un proyecto de explicar, a partir de las solas leyes de la mecánica que Newton ya había expuesto, había sistematizado en sus Principia Mathematica, él apuesta a que a partir de esas solas leyes puede hacerse un cálculo de la conformación actual del universo, ¿no? De las trayectorias, las velocidades, las fuerzas, los movimientos, las densidades, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Solamente siguiendo con rigurosidad las leyes de la mecánica clásica que Newton había fundado. Ahora, que este proyecto sea viable, Kant pensaba, está garantizado por 4 condiciones. Primero, que los cuerpos siderales son esferas, ¿no? Entonces, tiene la forma más simple que puede tener un cuerpo. Segundo, que los movimientos también son simples de estas esferas, y la forma más simple es la forma circular, ¿no? La forma más simple que puede seguir una trayectoria es la circular. Tercero, que el espacio en el que se mueven estos cuerpos está vacío, y ahí se utiliza el término leer, lo cual hace que tenga un movimiento no perturbado, ¿no? Un movimiento constante. Y finalmente, las distancias que separan a los astros unos de otros son inmensas, y eso ayuda a una más exacta observación y una máxima distinción, sostiene Kant, ¿no? Centrándonos en la tercera condición, la del espacio vacío, Kant no tarda mucho en introducir una advertencia, ¿no? Una aclaración. Él dice, no investigo aquí que este espacio pueda ser llamado vacío en todo el más genuino sentido, ya que en todo caso es suficiente observar que toda la materia que puede ser encontrada en ese espacio sería demasiado incapaz de poder perpetrar algún efecto, ¿no? Entonces, el abordar, o más bien la condición del espacio vacío, simplemente es una condición de índole mecánica para que no se perturbe el movimiento de los cuerpos. No es una condición de índole metafísica o ontológica sobre la naturaleza del espacio, y lo advierte allí, ¿no? Y después viene pues ya un fragmento grande, no lo leeré todo, pero con él inicia lo que conocemos ahora como la hipótesis nebular, ¿no? ¿Qué es la hipótesis nebular? Es esta hipótesis cosmogónica en la que Kant parece que es el primero que la formula. En un momento primordial, toda la materia del universo pues estaba concentrada, ¿no?, en algún punto, y después por las fuerzas de la mecánica, de las fuerzas de la materia que describe la mecánica, pues esta materia fue dispersándose hasta encontrar pues la estructura actual. Entonces, en la actual condición, ¿no?, pues ya dispersa la materia, la actual condición del espacio en la cual orbitan los orbes de todo el universo planetario, no existe ninguna causa material que pueda impulsar o dirigir sus movimientos. Este espacio es completamente vacío, o por lo menos tan adecuado como el vacío, ¿no? Vean otra vez la... Por consiguiente, antiguamente debió estar constituido de otra manera, es decir, lleno de materia suficientemente capaz de transmitir el movimiento a todos los cuerpos siderales y que se hallaban en él, y hacerlo concordar con el suyo propio, y etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, eso es, yo creo, lo más importante. Ahora, ¿a dónde se remonta el origen de esta idea, de esta intuición? Kant mismo dice: no negaré que la teoría de Lucrecio, ¿no?, filósofo romano del siglo I antes de Cristo, o de sus predecesores, Epicuro, o los atomistas Leucipo y Demócrito, tienen un gran parecido con la mía. Yo, al igual que aquellos filósofos, acepto el estado primitivo de la materia dentro de la dispersión general de la materia inicial de todos los cuerpos siderales o de los átomos, según los llaman ellos, ¿no? Y bueno, hasta ahí digamos, las alusiones que hace Kant al espacio vacío en este momento. A ver, ¿dónde inicia entonces el problema, según yo? Pues no en la filosofía de la naturaleza de los presocráticos, atomistas o mecanicistas, ¿no?, que ellos sostenían la existencia de un espacio vacío, sino en el origen de la astronomía. Y esta astronomía surge con lo que la tradición aristotélica, recordemos que Eudemo de Rodas, en el siglo IV antes de Cristo, y después Simplicio de Sicilia, ya hasta el siglo V, VI después de Cristo, eran comentadores. Bueno, Eudemo, discípulo de Aristóteles, y Simplicio de Cilicia, un comentador de Aristóteles, ¿no? Pues son ellos los que atribuyen el problema de los planetas a Platón. ¿En qué consiste este problema de los planetas? ¿Qué movimientos circulares, uniformes y perfectamente regulares hay que asumir como hipótesis para salvar los movimientos aparentes de los planetas? Sotsein ta phenomena, salvar las apariencias, salvar los fenómenos. Ese era el requisito epistemológico con el que surgió la astronomía de corte matemática o geométrica, inspirada pues por Platón. Aristóteles, aunque desarrolla también una astronomía, pero con un giro más físico, más observacional, no tan especulativo, tan teórico o geométrico como el caso de Platón, pero Aristóteles de todos modos asume estos presupuestos, ¿no?, del movimiento circular, el movimiento uniforme y el movimiento regular, y él desarrolla, vean, en la metafísica, también hay un párrafo grande, pero él menciona la estructura concéntrica y esférica del universo, ¿no? Y dice, el número de todas las esferas, se está refiriendo a las esferas, de las que mueven y de las que hacen girar a estas en sentido inverso, son 55. Pero si no se añaden al Sol y a la Luna los movimientos que hemos dicho, el número total de esferas será de 47. Así pues, este sea el número de las esferas. Entonces, a partir de este pasaje, comienzan los astrónomos a idear mapas o cartografías astronómicas con números elevadísimos, ¿no? de esferas, unas girando en sentido contrario, etcétera, intentando salvar las apariencias. ¿Cuáles apariencias? Lo que ellos llamaban la retrogradación de algunos planetas, ¿no? Que de repente parecía que se regresaban, o la variación en la intensidad de la luz de algunos planetas, ¿no? Esa también era una apariencia que este tipo de modelos no lograba salvar, porque pues la distancia en un modelo concéntrico, la distancia de los planetas siempre iba a ser la misma al ser circular su trayectoria, ¿no? Entonces era muy complicado. Bueno, en todo caso, Aristóteles inaugura también lo que conocemos como el horror vacui, ¿no? La naturaleza teme al vacío. Él decía que estas esferas, ¿no? Que hacían girar a los planetas, etcétera, tenían una naturaleza material, sólida, algo así como el éter, y que el movimiento de las esferas se comunicaba una a otra a través del rozamiento o de la fricción entre las distintas esferas, ¿no? Entonces no había un espacio vacío, sino que el universo aristotélico era un plenum, ¿no? Totalmente lleno de materia. Bueno, la astronomía helenística hace más sofisticado el modelo en términos geométricos. Según Ptolomeo, Apolonio de Perga es quien formula el modelo de epiciclos y deferentes, ¿no? Los epiciclos serían estos, y los deferentes serían los círculos que trazarían los centros de los epiciclos, ¿no? Entonces, era un modelo más o menos sencillo. Con esto se podría explicar, por ejemplo, la retrogradación de los planetas, etcétera, etcétera. Y Parco de Rodas, un poco después, agrega la llamada excéntrica, ¿no? Que es este punto, y dice, es equivalente el sistema de excéntricas con epiciclos, en términos geométricos, al sistema de deferentes con epiciclos. Y finalmente, Claudio Ptolomeo, ¿no? De Alejandría, agrega las llamadas ecuantes, ¿no? Un centro del círculo aparente, ¿no? De la aparente trayectoria de los planetas. Esto hizo muy compleja la astronomía. Geométricamente se hicieron modelos tan complejos como estos, pero era, repito, un ejercicio geométrico, ¿no? Recordemos que en la Edad Media pues, teníamos el trivium, al aparecer las escuelas medievales se estudiaba el trivium, gramática, retórica y dialéctica, y el quadrivium, y lo que estudiaban en el quadrivium era aritmética, geometría, música y astronomía, ¿no? O sea, prácticamente todo enfocado para elaborar este tipo de modelos. Y con esto, el problema platónico de los planetas, ¿no? Se transforma. O sea, ya no era qué movimientos circulares, uniformes, etcétera, pueden explicar los movimientos, sino qué combinación particular de epiciclos, deferentes, excéntricas y ecuantes puede explicar los movimientos aparentes de los planetas con mayor precisión y simplicidad. Lograban hacerlo con precisión, pero el costo fue muy elevado. No eran simples estos modelos, ¿no? Por eso en aquella época empiezan a surgir, pues como espíritu de la época, pues el principio de economía, la navaja de Occam, etc. O sea, no multiplicar los entes sin necesidad. Pero es repito, una especie de Geist, ya se me fue el espíritu de la época, ¿no? De Zeitgeist. Ahora, llega la revolución astronómica del Renacimiento, que de hecho inaugura la época moderna, que es una revolución que podemos entender en dos sentidos. Hay una revolución heliocéntrica, iniciada por Copérnico y ya consolidada con Galileo Galilei, y hay una revolución planetaria iniciada también por Kepler. O sea, es planetaria porque recuerden lo de las trayectorias de los planetas, para que Kepler es quien sostiene que no son circulares, sino curvas ovales o elípticas, ¿no? Y que pues Newton termina dándole la formulación matemática, presidente. Bien, aquí es importante, me parece, una cosa. Los aparatos ópticos, pretelescópicos y después el telescopio, al inicio de esta revolución no tuvieron un uso estrictamente astronómico, sino un uso que los historiadores de la astronomía llaman un uso filosófico, ¿no? ¿Por qué? Porque en realidad lo que ayudaron a descubrir, pensemos en Galileo, etcétera, fueron detalles o aspectos de lo que ya se conocía. Valles, montañas, elevaciones, cosas así, en la Luna, manchas solares, o los satélites de Júpiter, ¿no? Los satélites medíceos. Entonces, era un aumento cualitativo, digamos, de nuestra visión del mundo, nuestra visión del cosmos. Pero hubo que esperar más para que hubiese ya un uso geométrico y un uso astronómico, ya estrictamente astronómico, y tenemos aquí un ejemplo excelente de un uso astronómico ya del telescopio, con el caso de Römer. Römer, ¿no recuerdan este astrónomo alemán, holandés, que logra por primera vez calcular la velocidad de la luz, ¿no? Basándose en los eclipses de las lunas de Júpiter? Hace un primer cálculo en me parece que es el perihelio, ¿no? Y después hace una comparación ya en el afelio, estando la Tierra en el afelio, y ve que hay una diferencia en el tiempo que tarda en salir a la luz, no recuerdo cuál es el satélite, la Luna, se para. Entonces, a partir de allí, se hace una cosa genial. De hecho, 11 años antes de que Newton publicara los Principia Mathematica, Römer logra hacer este cálculo de la luz. ¿Por qué lo menciono? No nada más por el uso astronómico, sino porque es un ejemplo que después trae o incorpora a su pensamiento Kant, ¿no? Bueno, aquí pongo a Brahe. Brahe, estrictamente hablando, no se incorpora en el movimiento revolucionario de esta época, pero son importantes las observaciones que realiza, particularmente la observación de 3 satélites que ocurren entre estos años. Y con eso, además de confirmar el heliocentrismo, ¿no?, de Copérnico. Con esto logra restaurar, digamos, la idea del espacio vacío entre los planetas. El espacio interplanetario es vacío porque si no, no pudieran cruzar los satélites a través de esos espacios, como él había observado, ¿no? Entonces, es algo. Bueno, en la filosofía de la naturaleza o mecánica tenemos un debate que surge precisamente con Descartes. Newton objeta más bien a Descartes. Descartes niega la existencia del espacio vacío porque identifica espacio con extensión. Entonces, pues, no hay lugar para el vacío. Newton, en una obra previa a los principios de matemática, sostiene que sí, debe haber espacio vacío porque el espacio es algo distinto de los cuerpos que lo llenan. Después este debate se hace más fuerte, más sistemático también, en la disputa entre Clarke y Leibniz, ¿no? Y bueno, ahí lo tomo. Ya, no me detengo tanto. Aquí sí quiero hacer un apunte. Kant, en 1755, escribe una obra, bueno, es una disertación latina con la que obtiene la venia legendi, ¿no?, la licencia para poder enseñar como Privatdozent en la Universidad de Königsberg, y ahí hace una distinción muy interesante sobre los principios del conocimiento metafísico. Y él dice, bueno, hay un principio de razón consecuentemente determinante, y hay un principio de razón antecedentemente determinante. Para explicar esta distinción, él toma el ejemplo de los satélites de Júpiter que le permitieron calcular la velocidad de la luz a Römer. Y dice, a ver, los satélites es un fenómeno que nos permitió saber que la luz tiene una velocidad asignable. Es decir, no es infinita la velocidad de la luz, no es simultánea, sino que tiene una velocidad. No lo hubiéramos podido saber sin el fenómeno de los eclipses de los satélites. Dice, pero la razón que determina antecedentemente a este fenómeno es que el espacio presenta una resistencia al viaje de la luz. O sea, hay glóbulos de éter que resisten un poco y van aminorando la velocidad de la luz. ¿Sí? Entonces, no es un espacio vacío. Si el espacio estuviera vacío, la velocidad de la luz tendría que ser infinita. Entonces, tiene que haber una resistencia ahí. Bueno, ahí pongo unas conclusiones. ¿Cuáles son las conclusiones? Kant tiene mucho aprecio por la consideración mecánica o científica o matemática de ese espacio con materia muy poco resistente, infinitamente poco resistente, pero no asume el compromiso metafísico que implicaría la idea de un espacio vacío, ¿no?, de un espacio de naturaleza absoluta, distinto de los cuerpos, y que por lo tanto pudiera estar vacío, ¿no?, o independiente de los cuerpos, no llenado por los cuerpos, ¿no? Y nada más.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos un poquito menos de 10 minutos para preguntas. Perdón, tengo que antes.
Gracias. Muchas gracias por tu plática excelente. Perdóname si se me cuatrapea el español.
No,
estoy acostumbrado
al
al inglés en filosofía. Pues mi pregunta es acerca de esta otra corriente acerca del estudio del espacio en el periodo, namely la corriente metafísica, ¿no? Y tú has enfatizado la corriente que tiene que ver con las ciencias naturales, pero obviamente para este momento ya estaba publicada la Leibniz-Clark Correspondence, de lo que mencionas, y también era muy conocido el debate acerca de la naturaleza del cuerpo y si era solamente la extensión, como Descartes había dicho, o si consideraba algo más. Esta corriente metafísica es súper importante para el 1768, el ensayo de 1768 acerca de las incongruent counterparts, quién sabe cómo se dice eso en español. Sí, así es. Entonces, ¿por qué en este ensayo está influido por la cuestión metafísica, pero el early Kant está influido por la cuestión que tiene que ver con natural science? ¿O también hay cuestiones metafísicas también tan temprano? ¿O cuál es la, o sea, qué tanto influye cada corriente?
Sí. Es difícil distinguir en este momento entre ciencia natural y metafísica, digamos, del espacio, ¿no? Recordemos que todo esto forma parte de esta amalgama que se le llamaba, o sea, de ese universo un poco abigarrado, que se le llamaba filosofía natural. Entonces ahí podemos encontrar consideraciones científicas, netamente científicas, mecánicas, geométricas, etcétera, pero también consideraciones netamente metafísicas, que es el caso de Descartes. Es muy interesante la discusión que tiene en De Gravitatione et sobre el equilibrio equipondio fluidurum et solidorum, etcétera, de Newton, es de índole filosófica, es de índole metafísica, de hecho, más bien, ¿no? Si uno ve los argumentos que ahí ofrece Newton para decir sí hay espacio vacío, incluso algunos son hasta teológicos, ¿no? Si no hubiese espacio vacío, Dios no hubiese podido haber creado ese tipo de materia y cosas, ¿no? Exacto, ¿no? Entonces, es muy interesante. La discusión entre Leibniz y Clark es también, en este punto por lo menos, en la cuestión del espacio, es filosófica, ¿no? Es metafísica. Y eso es lo que recibe Kant, por supuesto, principalmente, pero también recibe los hallazgos netamente científicos que van teniendo ahí. Hay un profesor, Martin Knudsen, que quizás es el que mayor haya influido, y Rappold también, que haya influido mucho por lo menos en meterle el interés por la obra de Newton y de otros astrónomos de la época. Ahora, no deja de ser desconcertante, bueno, aunque ya está en otro periodo del pensamiento precrítico, la obra sobre las direcciones en el espacio, ¿no? Creo que es donde plantea lo del...
Sí, las regiones.
Exacto, la región, exacto. Allí no deja de ser desconcertante la conclusión, porque al final dice, para que esto funcione, o sea, bueno, recordemos lo de las contrapartes incongruentes, es el argumento para decir que el espacio puede tener una dimensionalidad mayor, ¿no? Entonces pone el ejemplo de las manos, nos dice que puede haber una cuarta dimensión, al igual que los topónimos de la segunda dimensión, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, no deja de ser desconcertante que al final dice, para que esto funcione debemos considerar el espacio como lo han considerado Newton y pero él todas las obras previas ha estado del lado de una concepción relacionista del espacio. Entonces, no deja de ser desconcertante y estoy enfocado en este problema también.
Muchas gracias.
Ya sabes que yo siempre he dicho que tu trabajo es de muy buena calidad, o sea, no necesitas que te eche flores, felicidades.
No, gracias.
Y te voy a hacer una pregunta que te he hecho también muchas veces, pero quizá de otra manera, ¿no? Ahorita que mencionabas a las contrapartes incongruentes y esto, ¿tú crees, sí, mi pregunta sería como, ¿por qué crees que es importante estudiar la filosofía precrítica, ¿no? Es decir, solo por una cuestión, solo, digamos, quizá no tendríamos idea de la teoría de los cielos o las fuerzas vivas o la monadología física, ¿no? Si Immanuel Kant no hubiera escrito la crítica de la razón pura y, ¿no?, por todas estas cosas sistemáticas, ¿no? O sea, entonces, quizá mi pregunta, por ejemplo, ¿tú crees que tiene una intervención contemporánea o digamos, pues no puede ser contemporánea porque la correspondencia de Clark creo que fue publicada en el 717 o algo así, pero digamos que está en el ambiente, ¿no? Y ¿cómo se llama? Pues, o sea, me pregunto si tu manera de leer la filosofía pericrítica es como si pudiera tener un valor por sí misma, independientemente de decir, por ejemplo, se sabe muy bien, ¿no?, que este argumento de las contrapartes incongruentes apareció en muchos textos a lo largo del periodo precrítico para diferentes usos, ¿no? Pero curiosamente no aparece en la crítica de la razón pura, ni siquiera para sostener la intuición como una forma de representación, ¿no? Entonces,
sí.
O sea, no sé si me entiendes mi pregunta,
Sí,
eso es todo.
Sí, bueno, creo que sí hay un valor del periodo precrítico o de los periodos precríticos, es un valor en sí mismo, por supuesto, ¿no? Pero también hay un valor en función de una mayor claridad de ciertas ideas o de ciertas tesis, incluso yo me atrevería a sostener, del periodo crítico. Voy a hablar basado en una mera sospecha ahorita, sobre todo con la cuestión del espacio. El hecho de que Kant no asuma el compromiso de un espacio considerado en términos absolutistas, ¿no?, como un espacio en sí mismo, independiente de los cuerpos, etcétera, no lo... ¿A qué voy? Me parece que muchas de estas características están en el espacio como...
O sea, me pregunto, una manera de preguntarlo es, quizás si tú crees que el argumento de las contrapartes incongruentes le da a Kant, gracias, que si el argumento de contrapartes incongruentes le da a Kant herramientas, por ejemplo, para intervenir en la polémica entre absolutistas y relacionistas, ¿no?, independientemente de su teoría posterior de la crítica de la razón pura, que evidentemente sí se posiciona, por ejemplo, en la estética trascendental, eso diría yo al menos,
claro,
en esa polémica. Entonces, si tú crees que hay posiciones ya, digamos, relevantes, propias de Kant, o como una posición intermedia o diferente de las que están ahí, sí, en pugna, ¿no? Sería un poco eso, para concretarlo un poco más.
Exacto.
Gracias.
En 1768, en esa obra particular, creo que sí tiene una posición intermedia, ¿no? Por eso repito, me parece desconcertante. Y a lo que voy es que estas características del espacio absoluto, como absoluto, independiente, etcétera, me parece que son características que también tienen que ver con el espacio de la estética trascendental. Entonces, necesito ahí estudiar más, analizar y leer más para ver cómo sería el tránsito, ¿no?, para cristalizar esta idea, pero a partir de esto que ha venido construido antes, ¿no? Entonces,
Gracias.
bueno, gracias.
Creo que sí.
Ah, ya. Sí, sí, sí. Claro que sí.
And I can use this.
Yes. And this is the mics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we'll hear from Emmanuel on absolute perfection.
All right, hello everyone, glad to be here. So to get right into it, Kant's inaugural dissertation proposes that one of the basic ends of our understanding is noumenal perfection, which is a principle of cognizing in theoretical contexts and a paradigm or common measure, as he puts it, for grasping other things. But this passage does not explain what noumenal perfection amounts to. And if noumenal perfection is both a normative goal of the use of our understanding and a principle of cognition, then fully understanding Kant's epistemology at this stage requires getting clearer on the character of noumenal perfection. In this talk, I'll first explicate Kant's early conception of what he calls absolute perfection and discuss how it relates to theories of ontological perfection in Wolff, Baumgarten, and Crusius. We'll see that for both Kant and Crusius, perfection in this sense turns on grounding relations rather than being a non-relational property of a substance. I'll then return to the inaugural dissertation to explore some epistemological implications and make some promissory remarks about the broader practical and normative significance of perfection in the lead up to the critical period. So Wolff and Baumgarten mostly define perfection as agreement in variety. They draw two consequences from this, one of which is that perfection can come in degrees, and the other is that imperfection is just disagreement in variety. But this raises the question of what sort of agreement or disagreement they have in mind. Kant himself suggests in early Reflexionen that this is not very clear. Wolff often explains agreement and disagreement in teleological terms. For example, when a gear in a clock does its job and helps tell time accurately, then the gear is exhibiting perfection. So a defective gear is imperfect because it prevents the clock from achieving its perfect end or its proper end or purpose. But it's not so clear that this can cover all cases of agreement and disagreement that Wolff has in mind, since he wants to say, for example, that the properties in the essence of each possible thing collectively exhibit perfection. But he doesn't really understand this as teleological in the sense that a possible essence kind of is just what it is. It's as merely possible, it has no intrinsic end or purpose. So in fact, in the very same section of his German metaphysics, Wolff suggests that another criterion for disagreement and variety is just logical contradiction. So that would allow possible essences to count as perfect, but now it looks like anything non-contradictory is perfect, which is not what Wolff is after. In sum, this account is pretty obscure, and Baumgarten does not really shed much light on it in his discussion. Seems like we could use a distinction here, and in fact, Kant offers such a distinction in his 1759 Optimism essay. Kant writes, perfection in the relative sense consists in the harmony of a manifold with a certain rule, no matter what that rule may be. In this sense, there are many frauds, many gangs of thieves, which are perfect in their fashion. But in the absolute sense, a thing is only perfect insofar as its manifold contains within itself the ground of a reality. The magnitude of this reality determines the degree of the perfection. So the first thing to note is that with this gang of thieves example, Kant is raising a new objection, or at least new to us objection, to the Wolffian account of perfection. The issue is not just that Wolff is ambiguous about perfection, but that perfection is properly an evaluative or normative concept. Promotion of perfection plays a fundamental role in the moral theories of Wolff and Baumgarten, as Kant was well aware. But a highly unified gang of thieves is worse than a disorganized gang. And Kant, you may know, he continues to use this kind of example in the ethics lectures later on, even in the 1790s, when he reportedly says that a perfect liar exhibits perfection in this relevant sense of harmony or completeness. So the problem here is that the teleological side of Wolff's account does not build in any restriction on the end that a manifold is supposed to harmonize with in order to be more perfect. The end is arbitrary. It might be robbery, for example, in the case of the gang of thieves. But there's more to this story, because Kant also refers to perfection in the absolute sense, which consists in containing the ground of a reality. And then, as he adds, the more reality something grounds, the more perfection the first thing has. Now, this is very abstract at this point, but I first want to stress that Kant is not saying that the more reality something has, the more perfection that thing has. The stress is on what the thing grounds. Now, you still might be wondering at this point why such a definition of absolute perfection has any more evaluative or normative significance than mere relative perfection. Is a gang of thieves more perfect because it grounds a robbery of greater magnitude? Seems like not. And I will come back to this question at the end, but first I want to go through more of the historical context, both in Kant and in his contemporaries. So to look, go on, there we go. So to look more closely at what it means to ground a reality, and for that reality to have a magnitude or size, some background is that as a count noun in the rationalist tradition, realities roughly mean attributes or properties that constitute beings, but rationalists also use it as kind of a mass noun, such that reality is, as Leibniz put it, quantity of essence. That means, at least, that reality can come in degrees, unlike existence or actuality. And Kant himself will later equate ontological reality in this sense with thinghood, is his term. Leibniz, in some texts, will go on to directly identify perfection with degree of reality, as in De Rerum Originatione Radicale. And Leibniz is followed in this by Meyer, for example, in his essay on the state of the soul after death. So both of them seem to be different from Kant because Kant is focused on the reality that something grounds. But this is not always appreciated in the literature because most commentators actually take Kant's early conception of perfection to just be something's intrinsic degree of reality. This is what I'll call the standard reading, and it was clearly articulated by Alison Lewine in the early 90s, and it's since then been echoed by Martin Schoenfeld and also by Henry Allison. There is some textual evidence for this, notably in a definition of metaphysical perfection in the L1 metaphysics notes that come later from the mid-1770s. But in the published work we've been looking at from 1759, Kant says something different. What he says is, perfection is not how much reality you have, it's how much reality you ground, as it were. In this passage, reality is distinguished from your own manifold, as Kant puts it. So it's not a question of grounding your own reality. It's clearly a matter of grounding relations to realities distinct from you. And in any case, Kant is very wary of the idea that something can contain its own ground. He denies this in the Nova Lucudatio in 1755. So some helpful context, though, might be that Kant is talking here in 1759 about optimism in the Leibnizian sense. So he's defending the idea that no possible world is better than the actual one. So he wants a useful metric of perfection, useful for measuring the perfection of finite things. In his view, divine reality is infinite and immeasurable. And he already thinks that measurement is finite and numerical, so divine reality is beyond measure. So we can, I guess, say that divine reality is greater than any other reality, but this can't afford an ordering of the perfection of finite realities. So this is why Kant's definition of absolute perfection is geared towards what God grounds in creation, namely a world, and here I'll quote Kant, beyond which a still better world cannot be thought, unquote. So this sort of optimal world, according to Kant, is still finite, and he says that anything we can think that's better than the actual world would be infinite, and so not a world at all. Now that's a very, I think, dismal attempt at theodicy, but the epistemology is maybe more interesting, because what Kant's saying here is that there's a certain property that God can perhaps be proven to have, proven a priori. This property is something like infinite intrinsic reality, but we can't determinately grasp such a property. As such, for Kant, there's no point in defining divine ontological perfection in terms of degree of reality, because we do want to use this concept of ontological perfection as a measure of finite things, to cross what Kant calls the chasm between God and finite beings. So he looks elsewhere, namely to the finite consequences God grounds, since these consequences are at least in principle within our epistemic reach, just because they are finite, or at least because they're finite. So one other important piece of historical context is that Kant may have been influenced by Chrysius here. So for Chrysius, some x's degree of perfection is sometimes defined in terms of the sum of effects which become possible or actual through that x. Now really, Chrysius is not consistent. He sometimes suggests the metric is instead the proportion between x and its consequences, which yields conflicting results. You can probably figure that out, but I can give examples in Q&A if you want. So sketchy as Chrysius' account may be, though, there's an affinity with Kant because perfection is defined not just in terms of x's intrinsic properties, but in terms of effects that make x possible or actual. The reference to merely possible effects and implicitly to x's capacities or powers will also have parallels in Kant later, we'll see. So Kant's distinction between ontological reality and absolute perfection gets further developed, I would say, around 1763 in his so-called early system. So here he sharply denies that first, all reality is the same as perfection, and second, that, quote, perfection consists in the highest degree of harmony in one. So the first proposal Kant rejects, that all reality is the same as all perfection, is roughly the standard way that he's been read in literature by Lewine, Schoenfeld, and Allison. So here, echoing the optimism essay, Kant says that we don't determinately cognize infinite reality and can't use it to measure finite things. He says in the negative magnitudes piece that the finite world has zero net reality in itself. So the world and God have two different, he doesn't say quite this, but I would paraphrase this as world and God have two different non-Archimedean quantities of in itself reality. And in that same essay, he adds that the idea of infinity has no cognitive value, it only has aesthetic value in stirring the emotions, but the idea of perfection does have cognitive value, so maximal perfection can't be infinite reality. So he's also here reiterating some kind of objection to the Baumgarten and Wolff definition of perfection, which he takes to be insufficiently general because it presupposes some relation to a being endowed with cognition and desire. So I want to suggest also that that Kant's metric of perfection is now more refined or complex compared to the optimism essay, because it now considers, as it were, not just the degree of reality of what you ground, but also the degree of reality of what, as it were, grounds you. If you don't depend on anything else, then you have maximum perfection in one respect, lucky enough for you, and Kant attributes this kind of self-sufficiency to God. The flip side would seem to be that if you're maximally perfect, you also have to ground everything else, but we'll see later that Kant, well, we'll see now, I guess, that Kant backs off from this. So I here want to consider how this notion of perfection fits into some of the broader commitments of Kant's Beweisgrund. So first of all, this new and more complex account builds on the Beweisgrund's principle that a consequence cannot exceed its ground. Specifically, a ground is less dependent than its consequences and has more power than them in Kant's terms. So you might, this might be familiar because there's a family resemblance with a Cartesian or Suaresian doctrine that a cause must contain more reality than its effect. But Kant's principle is more general because it's about grounds, which need not be causes. And Kant is also focusing on relations of dependence, not intrinsic reality. And also, his principle makes a reference to power, implying that the power to ground consequences need not always be exercised, which I'll come back to that. So the principle that consequence cannot exceed ground is important for the overarching project of the Beweisgrund, because Kant uses that principle to argue that God must instantiate moral properties, otherwise finite moral beings would exceed God in that respect, and that would violate this dependence principle. So at the same time, though, this is probably very well known to everyone here, Kant does not want to say that God literally instantiates every possible property. He thinks that then God would have inconsistent properties, and also, Spinozism would be lurking as well. So instead, he can use his distinction that I've been laying out between reality and absolute perfection to avoid a kind of Spinozistic outcome. Because he can say that God is perfect as an ungrounded ground of possible realities and not in virtue of instantiating them. To identify absolute perfection with reality would collapse this distinction between a ground and the possibilities grounded in it. So although Kant does not spell out positively how God is the ultimate real ground of all possibility, his account of absolute perfection plays a major role in the Weisgrund's attempt to secure divine transcendence. But still, Kant has something to worry about, at least one thing, which is that he, as we saw, now defines maximal absolute perfection as not depending on anything else, but he identifies maximal perfection with all sufficiency, as I've said, and it seems then that a maximally perfect being should not just be independent of grounds, but should ground all possible consequences. That would point at least towards occasionalism and maybe even towards Spinozism. And the next slide will say, though, that Kant wants to avoid that consequence. So he stresses in the late 60s, early 70s, especially in Reflexionen, that if God grounded the determinations of my will, then my actions would not even arise from me. I would be merely the means through which another agent acts. So he holds, then, that some finite actions are not grounded in God, so God does not ground every consequence. Given the way that Kant connects all sufficiency to power, though, this need not compromise divine all sufficiency. So in particular, God could have the ability to ground everything, and so be all sufficient in some sense, while refraining from doing so for moral reasons. Now, Kant does sometimes run a more metaphysical argument against a perfect being's grounding everything. For example, he suggests that if there's more than one substance that bears accidents, this is in the Herder Metaphysics notes, then no substance can ground all consequences. That's related to what Karl Ammerx has called Kant's restraint argument, on which even if God did miraculously determine our will, the resulting actions would still have to be partly grounded in us, in the sense that we are independent substances with the capacity to be determined. Both of those arguments, the restraint argument and the one I've laid out here, they both start with the premise that there's more than one substance. And that's interesting because Kant's metric of ontological perfection generates pressure for God to ground all consequences, even if that would mean that God created no independent substances. So it seems then that the only countervailing reason for God to create independent substances and perhaps diminish his absolute perfection stems in the end from moral or practical considerations, like the value of free and rational agents. So really, after all, those seemingly metaphysical arguments do ground out, I think, in practical moral considerations. But from the purely ontological point of view, such restrictions on what consequences a perfect being can ground might seem ad hoc. Kant will often repeat later that only maximal concepts have a priori logical determinacy. So there's a worry that this kind of restraint in God couldn't be grasped a priori, at least not theoretically. Okay, so we've taken this detour through the 50s and 60s. Let's now finally return to the dissertation where I started. So there's a puzzling passage here which I won't read out in the interest of time, but to point out a few features of it, the supreme being Kant's discussing here, he's portraying it as a paradigm or principle of cognition. As he remarks in the last sentence in this quotation, this kind of paradigm relation is a different grounding relation than God's efficient causal relation to the world. This is closer to formal or paradigmatic causation. And that's important because Kant doesn't want to say that God directly causes our cognitions. He instead gives a quasi-innatist story, maybe a lot of you know this, on which principles and axioms for cognition are, quote, given through the use, unquote, of our understanding in some way. No one really understands how. Anyway, at the level of justification, this looks like a top-down, broadly Platonist epistemology where the less perfect is cognized in virtue of limiting the more perfect. And that would be especially true on the standard reading of ontological perfection. So, as Lewin has concisely put it, on her reading at least, God is the maximum of perfection precisely because he contains the maximum of all reality, unquote. If so, Kant would be committed to our grasping God's infinite reality all at once, and then somehow limiting this infinite reality in our minds in order to cognize finite and imperfect things. Now, that is a picture that's coherent maybe, but could it be Kant's? If it were his picture, he would be ignoring his own worries over 10 years earlier, back in the optimism essay, about our inability to measure or determinately cognize God's infinite reality. In fact, there is ample evidence against the standard reading in the inaugural dissertation. Kant now has sort of worked out epistemological reasons related to his introduction of subjective forms of space and time for denying that the idea of an infinite degree of reality could serve as a paradigm or measure for the perfection of finite things. Infinite and finite properties are literally incommensurable. In a more positive way, he repeats his Beweisgrund account on which your perfection, as it were, is determined by, first, the extent to which you're a grounding principle, that is how many consequences you ground, and also by how many grounds you have, as it were. So once again, he portrays Kant as ungrounded and so maximally independent, but also as grounding at least the most consequences, just maybe not all consequences whatsoever. And again, he thinks that a consequence of God, namely the world, is how we can measure the perfection of finite things. Now, this is kind of a difficult issue that I can't get into too much here, but it's important that Kant's talking about the world qua noumenon, which, it's finite in some sense, finite number of substances as a noumenon, because the world as it's presented to us in space and time at this point is not distinctly cognized and also not really finite. Anyway, another problem for the standard reading is the way that Kant refers to God as a paradigm for practical and moral cognition. So he explicitly connects this to what, quote, ought to be in virtue of freedom. Now, maximal reality lacks any clear connection to freedom or to what ought to be. It just kind of is. So when Kant gets more specific about practical perfection, he actually appeals here to independence and self-sufficiency. The divine intellect is no mere cause, but a perfectly intellectual ground that avoids passive affection or governance by what's external to it. Being an independent principle in this sense is linked to practical perfection. But before discussing these evaluative or normative valences further, let me address some more epistemological consequences of reading absolute perfection in terms of grounding. So as I read the dissertation, our epistemic access to divine perfection is partly a posteriori. As in the optimism essay, we look to the form of the actual universe, and in particular to law-like causal interaction among finite substances. These features, according to Kant, are testimony to God as ground of all these substances, a ground which Kant says externally establishes the laws governing these causal interactions. Since this argument is premised on contingent systemic properties of the actual world, rather than properties of individual substances, I would describe it as a broadly teleological argument. But since this argument asserts that something exists that does not depend on any other thing, apparently on pain of regress, this argument also has some affinities with traditional cosmological proof. It's sort of somewhere in between. In any case, it has a posteriori premises, and this echoes the move made in the optimism essay, the move of shifting one's focus from intrinsic properties of God to the finite world that God grounds. Now, as we've seen, the inaugural dissertation does suggest we have an idea a priori of maximal perfection. And Kant may even still allow that we can establish a priori by the ontological argument he gave in the early 60s that some maximally perfect being exists. He also seems to think that we can have a priori conditional propositions such as if a maximally perfect ground exists, then there can only be one such ground, otherwise it wouldn't be maximally perfect. These conditional claims, which I assume he thinks are based on conceptual analysis, then link up with the teleological argument to get a conclusion Kant wants, namely that there's only one world in the sense of a causally interacting network of finite substances. And Kant also presents a challenging argument that space and time depend directly on God as a common sustaining cause, apparently because space and time are partly grounded in relations of real causal interaction. Anyway, remember though that Kant's conception of absolute perfection is relational. So when we get the a priori idea of an absolutely perfect being, this being is thought of as ungrounded and as having some fertile consequences. But what these consequences actually are is not deducible from that idea. Because of Kant's relational conception of perfection, his derivations of claims about the world do not fit the simple picture we might expect from top-down Platonist epistemology. On the simple picture, I merely contemplate God a priori and draw consequences from this directly via limiting my concept of the perfect being. Instead, for Kant, a crucial first step is an a posteriori teleological argument that links consequences in the actual world to some ground. And the a posteriori teleological argument is needed because, for Kant, it does not follow from the concept of a maximally perfect being that it grounds all consequences. Otherwise, he'd be a spinicist. As we've seen, Kant denies that the perfect being actually does ground all consequences. So if we can give an ontological argument that a maximally So even if we can give an ontological argument that a maximally perfect being must exist, it need not follow that the absolutely perfect being created our world. So to sum up all of this, very difficult stuff, Kant's approach to divine perfection starts with a posteriori premises. Observable features of the world require a ground. We then infer that this ground must fit our a priori conception of maximal perfection precisely because the a priori concept of perfection makes reference to what a perfect being grounds, and not just to intrinsic features of that being, such as maximal reality. Finally, we use the a priori concept of perfection to draw further conclusions about the world. So, this is not to deny that there are many problems with Kant's epistemology in the inaugural dissertation. The question for me, or that I'm interested in, is where these problems lie exactly. On the one hand, perhaps not enough attention has been paid to the role of a posteriori considerations here. These considerations, however, face well-known objections that Kant himself leveled in the Beweisgrund. So the form of the world may testify to a powerful ground, maybe even to a rational agent that chooses what Kant sometimes calls the highest architect of the world, or a highest architect. But it's unclear how that could get us to a maximal property, such as all-sufficiency. So the key question here is the precise status of our cognition of the form of the world, which seemingly must have a posteriori ingredients while also getting at noumena. On the other hand, to be a bit more positive, if Kant's top-down 1770 epistemology is conditional on some a posteriori premises, it's less dogmatic than standard readings assume. The actual grounding relations between perfect being and world is established a posteriori, so Kant need not insist that real grounding relations are all determinately grasped a priori in virtue of, say, intellectually intuiting God's maximal reality. Actually, as is well known, he expresses doubts about our grip on real grounding relations a priori, even in earlier works of the 1760s, such as the Beweisgrund and Negative Magnitudes. The latter essay asks, for example, how it could possibly get from the concept of God's will to the actual existence of the world by mere conceptual analysis. By 1769 or so, he is even saying in notes that all real grounds are cognizable only a posteriori. Now, to be sure, he does not settle here what he means by cognizable, so the point may concern fully determinate cognition of actual grounding relations, and also it's true that reflexionen should be taken with grains of salt. Still, even if Kant just entertained such an idea, the fact that he did so right when he was writing the inaugural dissertation is striking, I would say. Because if the dissertation had a simple top-down epistemology, cognition of real grounding relations should also be top-down and a priori, unlike what he says in these notes. But if actual grounding is instead grasped a posteriori, as I've suggested, then this textual tension is eased somewhat. Last thing I want to talk about briefly is the value of absolute perfection. Now, this is an especially complex issue, so I can only sketch 2 points here. The first of which is that Kant, at this stage, already defines laws in terms of independence of external determination. Now, a caveat here is that I'm not saying he invokes the moral law in the positive sense at this stage. He repeatedly denies in the 1760s that he's providing a full account of morality or practical philosophy. But there is interplay, I would say, between his notion of perfection as the absence of arbitrary external determination and his negative characterizations of law, which in turn identify necessary conditions for positive freedom and moral imputation. For on his mature view, a condition for an agent's following the moral law is independence of certain kinds of external determination via transcendental freedom. And second, the inaugural dissertation already invokes pure reason and its distinctive laws, and in notes from around the same time, he even suggests that rules of perfection partly constitute a science that arises from pure reason. Reason is credited with spontaneity and independence from sensory affection, and this point plays out both in Kant's account of theoretical understanding and in early discussions of practical philosophy. He suggests, for example, that some kind of spontaneity is prior to the good in these early notes, and in the critical period, he still takes perfection to be one of reason's regulative ideas. The Prillett's theology lectures, for example, begin by invoking perfection as a necessary idea of reason. Also, Groundwork 3 and other writings from the 1780s influentially suggest that pure reason, both theoretical and practical, is a spontaneous and independent faculty that we later backs off from such claims regarding theoretical reason, at least. Even his well-known attack on moral perfectionism near the end of Groundwork 2 allows that the idea of perfection correctly, albeit indeterminately, tracks features of the good will. Notably, the idea of perfection captures the good will's independence from merely sensible determination. Kant's critique of perfectionist moral theory may mostly target Wolffian relative perfection, which, as we've seen, he was already dubious about in the 1750s. So I'm going to leave you with some passages from the 1770s, which I I'm not going to get into today, but I think they indicate that Kant's early conception of perfection, rightly understood, plays a role in the development of the critical conception of reason, a role that is worthy of further study. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? We have about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Gotta give you the mic.
Thank you. Yeah. So, it's clearly that in the a posteriori teleological argument. Sorry, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
That the considerations invoked there are a posteriori in the from ground or from consequences sense, right? Like you're cognizing from the grounded, from the consequences of something. But need they? I mean, you never mentioned whether this was meant to be empirical claims or not. I mean, would there be space for having
No, I'm claiming that
non-empirical a posteriori cognition of say laws in the relevant period? I think this was the dissertation also that you referenced there, or would it always be empirical then in the kinds of cognitions that you're invoking there?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if I have to settle that kind of whether it's all or nothing kind of question there. So I just want the claim to be that at least some of the input into the teleological argument is empirical. So yeah, maybe you're alluding to something like an inverse square law. Like there are cases where he seems to derive features of physical laws from things in a very non-empirical way in that period. But which is, I could permit that, I think, on this reading as long as there's some empirical content there. But that's a good question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I learned a lot. I mean, I will probably do the exact same, namely it's a lot for people who are not as familiar with the material. So I wanted to ask something, sorry if you did address it, I think you didn't, but so you did mention how there's this shift to, or the difference between perfection in the sense of, let's say, ordinary predicates and then moral perfection. And I was wondering whether you can say something about how things work in that respect in the transcendental ideal in the first critique. Is this, or is it too far for you out of your, because there we also have this problem. Maybe you can just say something about it in relation to your talk, but at least the problem comes up there again, that Kant seems to start with the idea of ordinary predicates, I don't know, yellow, heavy, and he says, well, we have to understand these as restricting their perfection, but then ultimately God, at least in other writings from 1786, seems to say, no, God is to be understood as especially as, or primarily as moral perfection. So there seems to be then this gap between the two. So I was wondering whether you can say something about that.
Okay, I may have to ask you a question to make sure I understand the question. So, I mean, are you talking about the part of the ideal where he discusses the moral ideal, or just are you talking about the ens realissimum or something there?
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. Basically, how do the two connect? The moral perfection and then perfection of ordinary theoretical predicates.
Yeah. So I would say that the ideal is mostly concerned with an ens realissimum, which would be coextensive with, but not intentionally identical with, the most perfect being. Does that make sense?
Okay, so
like it's driven by the concept of maximal reality, and not by maximal perfection. Then you have to show via a proof that those actually only one being can instantiate both of those properties, right? So I don't think that the ideal is really dealing with exactly with this stuff. Maybe.
Okay. And I was thinking there is a passage in which Kant seems to say ens realissimum has now something to do with moral perfection. I was thinking of that, but okay, good, thank you. You say moral perfection, not at issue in a transcendental ideal.
Well, not
that
the main issue.
Question.
Not the main issue.
Thanks, Aaron. A very rich talk, and I also learned a lot. I was also curious about the connection to the transcendental ideal and the ens realissimum.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I would kindly ask you to maybe say more about the connection, if you like. My sense is that in the transcendental ideal, Kant still maintains the language of some totality of realities, and then, if I remember correctly, at some point he says, but actually, properly speaking, actually it's a ground of reality. It's not just a mere collection, something like that. If I'm correct, I might be wrong, but I think that's...
No, that sounds great, but I don't know if I can comment on this because...
No. So starting from this, my idea is that my intuition was that there's a way of reconciling the idea of maximum reality and the idea of ground of reality, so that they're not two radically opposite options, but actually there might be a way to see them as compatible. And another point related to this is at some point you said that, and you had the references and everything, that something infinite cannot be a paradigm for what's finite, and so you sort of use that as then to reject that kind of top-down model. But I was wondering whether if one insists on the ideal nature of maximum reality, so a maximum reality as an idea, which seemed to be what Kant was saying in that quote you had on the slide. Then again, if emphasizing the ideal nature of maximum reality can actually avoid this sort of top-down worry in a way. I mean, like in the theories, for example, where you have ideas that of, let's say, of the infinite that can still maintain a regulative value and not necessarily, without implying a commitment to a top-down kind of explanation.
Good. Well, let me take the second point first because the ideal, it's difficult. So that's a very interesting suggestion. So I think have set things up in the pre-critical period with Kant and the infinite leaves room for the kind of regulative role that you're talking about, depending on what that role is. So at one point I mentioned, I think, that Kant would allow in his early discussions of the infinite that you can know in a determinate way that something with an infinite property is, has more than any other thing of that property or of any finite thing. So that would allow for some kind of regulative, would have some regulative pull to it, and in fact that's sort of what he needs in a lot of these regulative contexts where like you always want something, to narrow down your species concept even further and further and further, and you never reach anything that can never reach an endpoint, or you always want to keep exploring space ad infinitum or ad infinitum because you have this idea, maybe inchoate idea of infinite space. So all of that is all well and good, I think. But what Kant's looking for here, coming off of the optimism essay, is something even more determinate, like a measure for finite perfections. And I think what he's denying is that the infinite, or even the idea of an infinite thing, could serve as a measure in that sense. There's just this problem of an infinite and a finite thing are not commensurable in his view. Maybe he's wrong about that for mathematical reasons, but that seems to be what he thinks even very early on. So for his earlier purposes, which are not just a regulative ideal, but some kind of determinate way of cognizing these finite properties in terms of the infinite, the sort of more regulative thing wouldn't be enough for him, but maybe it would be enough for the critical Kant, so that's good. So the ideal, no, I mean, I'm intrigued by this suggestion that maybe there's this sort of grounding thing going on there too, but I have to kind of beg off the ideal in some ways because I really don't even know, I can't even answer the initial question of how much of it is completely like in his own voice and how much of it is, this is reason dialectically grinding its gears and I'm diagnosing this. So until I could figure that out, it's hard for me to say what I think about those issues. But it's fascinating that you found texts that seem to be closer to what I'm discussing in the pre-critical than I might have thought. So that's really good to know. Thank you.
You have me thinking a lot. I don't quite even know what to ask, but having just taken a look at Wolff, I was sort of surprised. I had almost forgotten. So committed to pre-established harmony, right? Excuse me, according to which the world is sort of a unity on its own, which would do what it would do no matter what, even if the soul wasn't there, and then the soul is sort of a unity on its own, and we have a God outside both of these realms. in order to make this pre-established harmony occur. So I'm just, what do you make of, what is the world like in terms of, in the inaugural dissertation? It's not a place for pre-established harmony. I know Kant mentions transient forces as something important that he wants to establish, but what is the world insofar as it has us in it, things in it, and God in it, in the inaugural dissertation?
Oh, no, it doesn't have God in it. No.
Oh,
No.
Or related to it.
Yeah, in a one-directional way, not in an interactive way, right? So it doesn't want the world to be acting on God. Right. What is the world? That's a big question. I mean, I think it is interacting. I think what you're really asking for is like, what's the mind-body relationship in the inaugural dissertation? And that is, I don't know. I mean, that's too difficult to answer today, I think. Like he's still, I think, in crisis mode a bit about the worry that surfaced after his physical monadology of like, oh no, the way I'm treating these physical monads, actually it seems to work exactly the same way for minds, which would mean that aren't our minds just the same as any other physical thing? Then he's a materialist or something, or a physicalist, which he doesn't want to be. And, he tries to introduce space and time in the dissertation to help with this, but, where he stands in the noumenal level there, I think is unclear. But I'm certainly not committed on that either way in this talk. So. But it's a great question. Thanks.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, and finally, we'll hear from Timothy Franz on the justification of deduction in Kant's false, subtlety, and beyond.
Yeah, don't need a computer slide.
Okay.
Probably should.
But you need this.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity and for the attention. This will probably take the full 30 minutes. So I'll get started. Okay, so I want to analyze, as best I can here, Kant's 1762 essay, The False Subtlety of the Four Syllogistic Figures. And basically the point of this is to say that this is not, it's not a superficial work. I think it raises a metaphysical problem about logic for which the critique of pure reason may be the solution. So understanding this problem may help us better understand the critique. It may help us better understand the metaphysical deduction and even the relation between the transcendental analytic and the transcendental dialectic. So by way of introduction, here's the analysis in a nutshell. I think we can find three levels of argument in the false subtlety. First and most superficially, its main point is this: consider formal validity. Right? It's the special property of logical necessitation inherent in all arguments or good arguments that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And Kant is arguing that formal validity for us is not a divine power which mysteriously shows itself to us. So we should not treat the science of logic as if it were some esoteric technique for tracking patterns of validity which are present by divine decree. Instead, formal validity shows itself to be intrinsic to the basic kinds of judgment we make in cognition, right? Why does Kant make this argument? Well, at a second, slightly deeper level, he makes this argument because he cannot remain content with Wolff's account of the human finite intellect. Wolff wanted to base our cognition on a simple force of representation, which by directly responding to our positions, our bodily positions in space and time, joins together clear representations of the parts of objects into distinct representations of objects. Kant, by contrast, argues we can come to distinct cognition only by making judgments. Judgments are implicitly for him, inferences with formally valid consequences which we can rigorously test. This allows us to separate true from false judgments. So this is a better explanation than Wolff's of our ability to come to objectively valid cognition. However, this will lead to what I say is the third level. There, Kant discovers that if all inference is traced back to and grounded in acts of judgment, then inference as such, and its property of formal validity, cannot be derived from the traditional metaphysical principles of identity and contradiction. So the rationalist program, for example, Wolff's German metaphysics, is revealed for Kant to be a vicious circle. It presupposes the rules of deductive inference as valid in order to deduce those very rules from transcendent principles. This then is Kant's situation in 1762. On the one hand, he's committed to metaphysics. For reason, especially formal validity, requires justification. On the other hand, he knows that every metaphysical justification of reason is infinitely regressive. Attempts to deduce it always presuppose it. Given this situation, it seems that our rules of inference, and this is the situation in 1762, can only ever be subjectively valid. We have a syntax of logical thought, but it seems that we cannot have a metaphysics which can tell us about the semantics or the object of truth or reference of our thought. Finally, I will suggest that the critique is Kant's response to this problem. So this talk has 5 sections. First was just this introduction. Second, I will describe the basic problem posed by formal logic in the critique of pure reason as best I can. Third, and I'll go back to analyzing the false subtlety according to these 3 levels. Fourth, this very problem that I just mentioned, I will discuss it. And fifth and finally, I'll suggest how the critique may be a solution. So second, formal logic in the critique of pure reason is a puzzle. Consider 4 approaches. Karen de Boer takes a critique to reform Wolffian metaphysics, but not really needing a critique of logic. Hua-Ping Lu Adler argues Kant classifies and needs to classify formal logic as a science according to critical principles, but he cannot justify it as a science according to critical principles. Giorgio Tonelli says the critique is a treatise on logic as much as on metaphysics. He gives a lot of source material for this. Werner Flack states, interestingly, that in the commentary tradition, the guiding thought of Kant's philosophy has not been grasped even once, and finds that the transcendental analytic grounds the validity difference of cognition. Given this disparity, however, I think we can reliably identify 2 basic aspects of the science of formal logic in the critique, the syntactic and the semantic. Kant takes formal logic to be the science of the logical syntax of thought. In other words, formal logic analyzes thought in terms of its validity, its formal validity, but it gives no interpretation of the objects to which it is applied. On the other hand, he specifies the semantics for the application of formal logic, right? These are the categories schematized, right, over possible objects of experience. The syntax, this syntax is valid for this semantics, but beyond it, so I will suggest it cannot be valid. So consider briefly the syntactic aspect. Formal logic has the logical syntax of thought and its validity as its object. I think this is clear from the B edition preface of the critique. Kant shows there that formal logic it presents the criteria of a proper science, which he had outlined previously in the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. Formal logic has its own principles, for in it, the understanding has to do with nothing further than itself and its own form, so that it excludes principles of extraneous psychological, metaphysical, or anthropological origin. Second, it is a whole of cognition, which is ordered according to these principles. It has its own limitation to the form of thought. Third, its certainty is apodictic, since it exhaustively presents and strictly proves nothing but the formal rules of all thinking, whether this thinking be empirical or a priori, whatever origin or object it may have, and whatever contingent or natural obstacles it may meet in our minds. So in this sense, formal logic for Kant has seemed since Aristotle, to all appearances, to be finished and complete. He confirms this argument in the introduction to the transcendental logic by introducing Wolff's general logic, right, which is sort of, for Wolff, a priori meaningful in ontological and psychological senses, and then Kant basically states that general logic, pure general logic, is not it's not an organon for any particular cognition, right? And nor is it an applied logic with sort of a priori psychological features. Freed from these extra-logical concerns, Kant reduces Wolff's pure general logic to Aristotle's science of the syntax of logical thought. It is a canon of the understanding and reason, but only in regard to what is formal in their use, be the content what it may, empirical or transcendental. So Kant calls this pure general logic, freed from extra-logical elements, formal logic. So, and in this, his intentions seem clear, right? Perhaps, right, by reducing general logic to this formal science of thought, he can freely investigate the possibility of scientific metaphysics without being shackled to any logic which has implications for how objects should be constituted. Commentators are rightly suspicious of this argument. I know that Lou Adler, in their excellent book, Kant and the Science of Logic, raises 4 relevant questions. First, does formal logic have a proper subject matter? If its object is thought or the rules of logical thought, what beyond Kant's statement, his word, makes this so? Second, how does it relate to other sciences, especially metaphysics? Third, how does Kant prove that formal logic it cannot serve as an organ a priori for any other science, like mathematics? Fourth, if formal logic truly is a science, what is the origin of its principles and forms or rules by which it can prove the validity or invalidity of arguments? At first glance, it does not seem that Kant answers these questions in the Critique. He may assume this position for convenience. Even worse, Lou Adler suggests Kant cannot answer these questions. She takes the foundational principles of formal logic to be generative rules. So in this sense, they would be the origin of the kinds of thought we have, and they would be more fundamental than the mere veridical rules for proving formal validity of particular thoughts. So it would follow from that if formal logic produces the very forms which it evaluates, then its basic principles would lie beyond the bounds of the critical use of our reason. They would be the preformed germs or predispositions of our thought, but our thought is exclusively spontaneous and epigenetic. It can only reflect on its acts and its products, but not really on its origin in the sense. Lou Adler's questions, I think, let us move from Kant's syntax to his semantics. I take them to be semantic questions. They ask if Kant can sufficiently explain the origin and meaning of the rules of valid inference according to scientific criteria. Does Kant have a semantic doctrine in the Critique which answers these questions? Well, in the introduction to the Transcendental Logic, he states that philosophy has never yet correctly understood or answered the fundamental question, what is truth? It is reasonable to think that Kant's response to the question of truth contains a semantics of formal logic, or that his transcendental account of truth is a semantic justification of the logical syntax of thought. And in the conclusion, I'll try to suggest what this justification might be. So now on to the third section, to analyze the false subtlety according to the 3 aforementioned levels of arguments. So first, Kant argues that because he can base the purely syntactical system of Aristotle's syllogistic on our acts of judgment, anyone who views formal logic as a technical game for discovering patterns of formal validity as if looking at a chessboard or detecting an anagram in a name is guilty of a false subtlety. A divine power of logical necessitation is not present in our logical manipulations. If it were, it would still not really aid in any valuable cognition. Kant spends the majority of the article deriving the syllogistic from acts of judgment to support this thesis. But it really results, I think, from an argument at a deeper level of the article. Mihaela Vatavu, in a 1992 article, has identified, I think, the second level of argument. Kant is grounding the syllogistic on acts of judgment because he is convinced that Wolff's theory that clear and distinct concepts generated by a simple force of representation responding to its environment cannot explain human cognition as essentially intellectual. Right? Again, Wolff defines a distinct concept of an object as one composed of clear representations of the parts of that object. Kant responds that this definition, even if correct, is not sufficient. To see this is Kant's example. Consider the question of animal cognition. If an ox represents its stall, then its representation of its stall includes the clear representation of its mark of having a door. Because a representation is distinct, if its partial representations are clear, the ox has a distinct representation, and this in turn is a mark of the possession of intellectual cognition by the ox. Right? But for Kant, intellectual cognition is something higher. He says the distinctness of a concept does not consist in the fact that which is a mark of a thing is clearly represented, but rather in the fact that it is cognized as the mark of the thing. In other words, intellectual cognition consists in the active use of concepts to establish that marks of objects are in fact marks of those objects. We make judgments about objects, come to certain conclusions, test those conclusions. If we are wrong, it is thanks to the power of formal validity that we are forced to revise our premises. So we establish distinct cognition only by judgments which have deductive force. And I think here Kant's already saying something very important for the Critique. he is basing both concepts and inferences on judgment. This will allow him to distinguish in the critique between merely logical cognition of what is clear, what is distinct, what is not, which is applicable to both what is sensible and what is intellectual, and transcendental cognition. Right? For the latter arises in reflection on the understanding in general. As he will say, the difference between an indistinct and a distinct representation is merely logical, does not concern the transcendental content, namely whether a representation is sensible, like body, or intellectual, like right. In any case, this argument leads to the third, deeper level, where Kant realizes the metaphysical consequences of his argument. Like Wolff, he portrays judgments as thoughts we intend to establish as true of objects, sure, but since judgments are in principle forever revisable, they are recursive or reflexive, they are mediate cognitions which involve marks or concepts which relate to each other, perhaps more immediately than they relate to their objects. So this allows Kant to diverge from Wolff by grounding the syllogistic on acts of judgment. These immediate relations which are possible between the terms of judgment become inferential relations. The most fundamental of these become the rules for all inferences. Most importantly, they are the highest rules or principles of deductive inference. For again, Kant will find that the Leibnizian Wolffian effort to derive these rules of deductive inference from the highest metaphysical principles, i.e. identity and contradiction, presupposes those very same rules. Traditional metaphysics then is revealed as viciously circular, and again, this means that Kant finds himself trapped within a subjectively valid syntax of logical thought. He is unable to justify its claim to objective validity. This is not, of course, philosophically satisfying. And now we can go into the false subtlety more closely to sort of understand this third level of the text. So it is an essay which has 6 sections. In the first, Kant finds the perfect universal syllogistic moods, namely Barber and Celarent, stem from acts of judgment. Right? The argument is as follows. In a judgment, we take the subject term to stand for an object. By the copula is, we compare predicate terms with representations of the object. We affirm or deny these predicate terms so far as they characterize the object or fail to characterize it. When they succeed, we call them identical with the subject term. When they fail, we say they contradict the subject term. I think that Kant's taking these principles of identity and contradiction in an exclusively syntactic sense. That is to say, the meaning of the acts does not follow from the principles. Conversely, the meaning of the principles follows from these acts. So far, these acts have the basic forms, right? A is B, A is not B. Again, since we relate to objects via representations of them, judgments are mediate. We relate concepts to concepts or marks to marks with the intention of stating a truth of an object, right? We have this anticipates the definition of judgment in the critique as the mediate cognition of an object, hence the representation of a representation of it. This in turn means that any judgment is implicitly a syllogism, right? Every judgment which is made by means of a mediate mark is a syllogism, Kant says in the false subtlety. So the immediate affirmation of a cognition of an object has the form of Barbara. A is B, B is C, therefore A is C. Immediate negation of a cognition of an object has the form of Celarent. A is not B, B is C, A is therefore not C. And I think this anticipates the definition of a syllogism as in the critique as itself a judgment determined a priori in the whole domain of its cognition. Importantly, in section 2, Kant will argue that this interpretation of these perfect syllogistic moods yields the first general rules for all affirmative and negative syllogisms. And he says, the first general rule of all affirmative syllogisms is this: a characteristic mark of a characteristic mark is a characteristic mark of the thing itself. And the first general rule of all negative syllogisms is that which contradicts the characteristic mark of a thing contradicts the thing itself. Kant says neither of these rules is capable of further proof, for a proof is only possible by means of one or more syllogisms, so that attempting to prove the supreme formula of all syllogisms would involve arguing in a circle. So I'm saying this is Kant's syntax of logical thought. Right? If we hold the first thing to be characteristic of a second, which is in turn characteristic of a third, the first must be a characteristic mark of the third. And the same holds for negative inferences, right? We have to assume that if we apply either kind of inference in experience, but reality conflicts with our conclusion, we must revise our premises. But what philosophically justifies this assumption? So in sections 3 and 4, then Kant he argues that the moods of the other syllogistic figures, right, the imperfect or mixed syllogisms, are reduced easily to the first, right, by means of E conversion, right, no A is B to no B is A. The second figure mood Cesare is reduced to Celarent. That's for all second figure moods except Barocco, which needs reductio. By means of A conversion, right, all A is B to some B is A, I conversion, some A is B to some B is A, or reductio, the third figures, moods are all reduced to the first. Kant rejects the fourth figure as superfluous. He implies that these immediate inferences are also grounded in reflection on acts of judgment. And in section 5, he concludes that since the mixed figures really are modifications of the first by conversion, it's really a false subtlety to treat the division of the syllogistic figures as a meaningful theme, right? In other words, we can't really learn anything important about cognition from this division. Okay, so now 4, where do we find the metaphysical problem about logic? The critical problem here, well, in section 6, Kant concludes that his account of judgment does a much better job, right, of accounting for intellectual cognition than Wolff's force of representation. But departing from Wolffian metaphysics means facing anew the philosophical problem of the justification of deduction. What gives formal validity its objective reality, really? What accounts for, in other words, the specific difference of intellectual cognition as judgment, right? Kant says if one succeeds in understanding what the mysterious power is, which makes judging possible, one will have solved the problem of this specific difference. This problem most clearly emerges in the text when Kant defines his basic rules of inference and states, again, neither of these rules is capable of further proof. I think we can reflect on this and find it is a convincing argument. For example, we can assume with Leibniz and Wolff that judgments are true by being reduced to definitions grounded on the principles of identity and contradiction. Right? It would be a contradiction to deny a definition. So definitions are identity judgments like A is A. They can be expanded as virtual identity judgments like AB is A or ABC is AB. It would follow that the syllogistic mood Barbara can be based on this principle as the inference ABC is BC, BC is C, therefore ABC is C, right? And since the rationalists take the principle of identity and contradiction to also be constitutive, right, that they're constitutive of both thought and objects, right, this seems like a powerful way to justify deduction. But I believe it requires the principle of identity to be defined something like as follows. Whatever is true of a thing is true of whatever is identical with it, right? This should, for Wolff, for example, legitimate the substitution of terms considered to be identical. The Achilles heel of it, however, seems to be that the term to be defined, identity, occurs in its own definition and it seems to be empty. Moreover, in whatever is true of a thing is true of whatever is identical with it, whatever is true of, right, in there functions as a middle term between one thing and the other thing held to be the same as it. But this means that it is an inference, and it must presuppose as valid Kant's first rule of affirmative inferences. A characteristic mark of a characteristic mark is a characteristic mark of the thing itself. So we may see that Kant is right. The rationalist proof of the syllogistic is only possible by means of one or more syllogisms, and it involves arguing in a circle. It may also mean that our syntax is closed. Any attempt to prove it presupposes it. So the question is, how does Kant then merely presume the validity, does Kant merely presume the validity of our syntax, or does he try to justify it in a new way? I think he already explores a new way in section 2 of the false subtlety. He observes that logicians traditionally justify the syntax of the syllogistic by the principle of the dictum de omni et de nullo. This is Aristotle's semantic definition of universal affirmation and universal negation, right? It's given in the early part of the prior analytics. It states that the universal affirmation of a predicate term of a subject term, right, all A is B, is true if and only if, quote, no examples of the subject can be found of which the other term, the predicate term, cannot be asserted. Similarly, the universal denial of a predicate term of a subject term is true if and only if no examples of the subject can be found of which the predicate can be asserted. This dictum, right, it's usually interpreted extensionally, like as you might, if you're working with Venn diagrams or something like this. All A is B is true if and only if everything which falls under the concept of the subject also falls under the concept of the predicate, right? And of course, if all A is B is true for this reason, then and all B is C is true for that reason, then of course all A is C, right, must also be true. And metaphysics, I take it from Aristotle to Wolff, supports this extensional interpretation for the sake of the justification of logic. However, Kant reverses the traditional order of justification, right? That is to say, the dictum de omni will be true because of his syntax and not the other way around, right? Keeping to his belief that no further proof of his rules of affirmative and negative syllogisms is possible, he argues that those rules are the ground of the extensional interpretation of the dictum. By how we relate marks or concepts immediately to each other in the judgments we make, well, we construct concepts of objects which fall under those concepts. So, higher concepts have more abstract intensions, but expansive extensions, while lower concepts have more concrete intentions, but limited extensions. So, for Kant, he says, the dictum de omni et de nullo is true simply for this reason. I would say this reversal of the tradition is far from being a successful justification of deduction. As it stands, right? This is because as it stands, it begs the question of whether the concepts we produce are in fact, or can in fact be true or false of objects, right? Kant raises this problem in the attempt to introduce the concept of negative magnitudes into philosophy, also written in 1762. Because judgments we produce and experience should be true of objects, they should generate concepts which reflect real grounds, not just logical grounds. But how is it possible to conceptualize real grounds or consequences, or causes and effects, without begging the question? Right? We can certainly construct a concept of a cause and call one of its characteristic marks its effect, so that we can discover by logical analysis, right, of the concept of relation that we call one between cause and effect. But in doing so, we only find that our concept of the effect is identical with what is already contained in the concept. However, Kant says the real ground or cause of something is one thing, and the consequences or effect is something completely different. The main question is, how am I to understand the fact that because something is, something else is? I think because of Kant's isolation of the domains of syntax and semantics, he is certain that there is an absolute difference between logical and real grounds. Therefore, the false subtlety already implies the crucial transcendental question Kant asked 10 years later in the Hertz letter: what is the ground of the relation of that in us, which we call representation, to the object, right? If we are to have a true semantic interpretation of objects, we require a set of pure concepts with an objectively valid relation to objects. But given, again, this absolute difference that I have mentioned, right, there can be no direct relation between the two. As Kant says, our understanding through its representations is neither the cause of the object, save in the case of our moral ends, nor is the object the cause of our intellectual representations in the real sense, right? Therefore, the pure concepts of the understanding must not be abstracted from sense perceptions, nor must they express the reception of representations through the senses, but though they must have their origin in the nature of the soul, they are neither caused by the object, nor do they bring the object itself into being. So this is the problem, and we'll move to the conclusion. What does the critique perhaps do about this, right? In the fifth section here, so I will suggest how the critique is the solution to the seemingly insoluble problem of the justification of deduction. Kant describes the Copernican turn as the procedure in which we assume that the objects, or what is the same thing, the experience in which alone they can be cognized as given objects, conforms to those concepts which we establish a priori of them. From the perspective of our problem, this means that we must know somehow that a set of concepts applies a priori to objects so that we can take the dictum de omne et de nullo to be a legitimate semantics for the justification of the syntax of logical thought. But how is this possible? What kind of experience can we legitimately conceptualize a priori? The Hertz letter argues that real grounds cannot immediately determine logical grounds, nor logical grounds immediately determine real grounds. However, perhaps a third way is possible, since we also try to actively prove our thoughts to be true. Kant can outline the a priori conditions for conducting scientific proofs. He can develop a proof-theoretic semantics of experience. So his semantics can arise from the conditions for proving judgments about objects to be true, right? Or in other words, he can specify experience as consisting solely of what we can argue rationally about, or attempt to prove to be true or false. I want to say this suggests a new approach to the critique. First of all, we may read the metaphysical deduction in a new way. Normally, it is taken to outline Kant's formal logic. Perhaps it is more than this. Perhaps it is an outline of the pure use of formal logic in the conduct of proof, right? To see this, consider the conduct of proof as we still use it, right? We can begin with a categorical judgment to be proved true or false, such as the earth is flat. If we want to falsify this, right? Because to prove it true, we might want to try to falsify it and then rule out all possible cases of falsification, right? To falsify it, we can find a condition under which it would be false and make a hypothetical judgment. If the pole star is not always at the same height above the horizon, the earth is not flat. We observe and confirm that the pole star is at different heights at different places, and in fact, we can then conclude with a disjunctive judgment, right? The earth is not flat, but it is some other shape. This is Kant's own example, by the way, from the Yeshe logic. Mathematical proof has the same structure, a slightly different method. Crucially, proof requires categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive inferences, right? First, it's formed as a hypothetical inference, then as a categorical and disjunctive, and it involves, I think, all the other Kant's elements that he specifies, like singular judgments, infinite judgments, and a modal structure, right? Second, maybe we can better understand the relation between the transcendental analytic and the dialectic. The transcendental analytic specifies, under this interpretation, a semantics for the conduct of proof. The result of it as an argument, as a whole, would be that any cognition according to the laws of nature, specified by the schematized categories, involves formally valid inference. So the analytic is, in that sense, a soundness proof. However, it by itself does not rule out our ability to make formally valid inferences beyond experience. Perhaps if we could, this would forever tempt metaphysicians to construct extra experiential metaphysical systems. For this reason, perhaps, the transcendental dialectic is a completeness proof. Right? Its result would be that one could certainly attempt to maybe think beyond experience, but given any claim to cognize beyond experience, to cognize the ideas of the soul, world, or God as objects, the corresponding inferences cannot be formally valid. So I suggest that this reading may answer Luader's questions with which I began. Kant proves that formal logic must have thought as its object, since for Kant, formal logic cannot be anything but the conditio sine qua non of the conduct of proof in experience. 2, he proves that formal logic cannot be an organon for any other science, perhaps because he begins the critique with an aporia regarding the justification of formal validity in general. And he cannot solve this problem by presupposing the validity of any particular domain of cognition. 3, right, he doesn't obtain his rules of inference in an arbitrary way, but seemingly in a well-grounded way, right? Finding in 1762 that the traditional justification of the categorical syllogistic is infinitely regressive. It presupposes itself in every attempt to derive it from a higher principle. So what does he do? In the critique, he puts this infinite regression, as it were, to work, and asks himself what it can do, and he bounds the realm in which we can apply logic to prove our thoughts to be true or false. This indirectly justifies formal logic as the discipline, right, which does not need to distinguish between singular and universal judgments, or between affirmative and infinite judgments, but it can analyze the formal validity of judgments in or about experience, right, according to its principles. Finally, 4, the entire critique of metaphysics is also then, at least this is the suggestion I would like to explore, a critique of logic, which proves that formal logic is adequate to the critical use of reason, so that the critique is, as Giorgio Tonelli suggests, a treatise on logic as much as on metaphysics. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over. Okay.
We have 1 minute, so
One.
maybe like a couple of questions. Okay, and then
I'll try.
if that's okay.
I think so.
This is just clarificatory, I think. I just wanted to ask, to be sure, you think that both Wolff and Kant accept the dictum de omnium et nullum as a principle of categorical syllogisms, but they have different accounts of what grounds that principle? Like Kant has his, what you call the logical syntax of thought is grounding this, and Wolff has some other ground. Is that correct?
I absolutely do. Actually, Wolff will say in the German logic that the principle of contradiction essentially grounds the dictum de omni de nullo. And you'd have to explore precisely how it does it. He doesn't say, but he says it just is. And in the Latin logic, he will extend the dictum de omnia de nullo to definitions, right, explicitly, which means yes. That's how he does it. Yes. And Kant doesn't do it like that.
Yes, thanks. Maybe a similar kind of question, but I guess I never really heard, so what makes thinking thinking, and if it really can be detached from the concept of truth or the more reference extension type targets of the content. So it sounds like the analysis you want to give is we have thinking about thinking, and it's all at the level of contents, and it's a kind of theory of sense in the Frege sense of Sinn, like Husserl has this distinction too, and we don't talk about truth values or references, and somehow that's a self-standing content, or a domain that we can reflect on and prove things about. But
Right.
I guess, like all the people who want to know what, in virtue of what do we call it thinking, rather than just some relation of structures, and it's hard to know how to even get it off the ground if you don't think of thinking as essential. Part of its essence is to be possibly true. And so then I don't understand what it would be to explain or prove things about thinking without appealing to the connection to the reference in that Bedeutungen sense of Frege. And so then people are tempted, like I worked on this a while ago, and there's a whole tradition of people wanting to see Kant as more like a logic of sense person at the bottom, and an intention first somehow. But it does seem a little bit tricky insofar as if in his understandings of the understanding and reason, anything about truth is essentially constitutive, even if it's not like everything is true, but it's essentially a faculty for the relation to what is true. I don't see how you'll be able to detach it at the level of the essence of thinking to get a self-standing, deducible, provable domain that doesn't include as its presupposition, this is all about truth or something like that. So I don't know if you have any replies to that, but.
I'll absolutely try. And what I think is that I think Kant would agree with you, and I think that's why he's committed to metaphysics, because he knows that you can't investigate truth and sense as an isolated phenomenon. It needs a justification somehow, and that is always a sort of a semantic justification, right? A relation to what it is about, right? Sure, like you have Wolf, metaphysics. It's not just, hey, let me tell you about the soul, the world, and God. It's a way to justify a priori, right, by these structures, these real structures, the semantics or the syntax, excuse me, of our logical thought as rational beings, right? So we find ourselves to be, we think we're rational, and we want to justify this. Because we can't do it purely syntactically. So that's the situation Kant finds himself in. He absolutely thinks this type of semantic justification of logic is necessary, and it should be done a priori. But he thinks that the Wolfian effort is viciously circular, right? And what do we do with this problem now? Well, we must justify, right, our logic and sense, sure. But every attempt to do so presupposes what we're trying to do, right? So again, it's a problem. And so, what does he do with that situation? I don't know if this is direct, but he then says, well, let me put this infinite regress again to work and find. Again, this is what attracts me to it. He's saying, okay, now, well, let's say that we actively prove things to be true and false. What are the conditions of our ability to do so? Well, it's these categories, it's the world. The real world must be like this for us, right? And that's his soundness or semantic proof. Those which have a different structure, right? That has a different structure than the structure of logic, importantly, right? Because that's the semantic structure. but it should be a soundness proof. And then he can go on and do a completeness proof in the dialectic, which is something completely different. But that's my attempt to answer. So,
Okay, let's thank our speakers, please.